One of the big problems I believe that plagues the comic book industry are that a lot of creators are stuck in the past. And instead of being forward thinkers that focus on creating material for readers of today, they go back and try to recreate older stories from generations ago. Um, what I've seen from a lot of creators over the last 10, 15 years is a drive to recreate older stories from 30, 40, and even 50 years ago. And that's not going to be relatable to readers of today. The world of the 1980s and the 1970s was a completely different world than the world of today. And comic books are primarily supposed to be a commentary on what goes on in the world. And we're not seeing that commentary being depicted in the art and literature inside of a comic. Instead, a lot of creators are just going back and reminiscing about the good old days. And that's really bad for the medium. We can't go back and talk about older stories because readers don't relate to older stories. That's a different era. Um, and I can give you an example. A couple of months ago, I saw an ad for Marvel Comics Secret Wars. Now, the Secret Wars, when they first came out, I was about 10 or 11 years old. This was about 1983, 1984. And that was a big event back then. Good guys and bad guys going to this battle world sent by the Beyonder to see which one would win. But today, no one's going to really relate to that. To them, to the kids of today, that doesn't have, any bearing. I mean, yes, you're going back to this old material, and the older readers who are my age, who are like 42 and up, we can relate to that because that's our time. But the kids of today, their world is completely different. So when they look at these characters talking about a secret war, they look at it and go, this doesn't relate to me. I mean, where's the things that I relate to? When I write stories, I would say to myself, what do kids of today relate to? What is their world? What is their experience? And I find when I did the research, it was a completely different world. Um, but I'm not seeing anybody trying to make serious efforts to give that audience their world, their stories, and their experience. And I believe comics are suffering because people don't want to give the reader their world, their stories, and their experience. Because the kids who grow up today, they're growing up with things like social media, and they're growing up with things like a changing job market where it's very unstable. So they don't really focus too much on, you know, full time careers. They do a lot of freelance and indie work. So I'm not seeing, that type of model, those type of things being presented in, today's comics. I'm not seeing people seeing their experience being presented to them in their own stories. And that's it's just sad because, the comic medium again is meant to be a social commentary on the world. Superheroes themselves are social commentaries on what's going on in the world and what people relate to. But when I go and I read comics today or I take a look at comics today, there's a lot of jumbled. It's very jumbled. It's very directionless. There's not much of a focus on anything, and there's no real structure or real form. And I look at it, and that's really shows that a lot of creators don't really understand how to create stories for the readers of today, stories that readers of today can relate to, and characters that readers of today can identify with. And it's sad because I believe the stories are there, and all it takes is a writer to start using their skills to adapt these characters to fit them. I mean, a lot of these I've seen some really good modern day adaptations like the animated Spectacular Spider-Man cartoon. Young Justice did a pretty good job, but in the comic medium, I'm not seeing that. I'm on television; they're doing a good job of it. They did a great job of adapting those characters for modern times, but I'm not seeing that in the comic book medium. And the whole thing is that I believe a lot of writers have a big problem understanding how to use continuity. Now, continuity, a lot of people they're focusing a little bit too much on the history and the timelines, when continuity is not meant to be used like that. Continuity is more of a tool. I mean, when you make an older story, what you're going to do is you're going to pick story points from that previous story to create a brand new story. You're not going to just take the entire story and then try to create a brand new story around the existing story. You're just going to take maybe one or possibly two story points. And I can give you some examples using my own material. Now, um, one second. Now, from a single, scene in the first ISIS, I wound up, you know, killing off the East character, and then after that, I wound up bringing her back. And after I brought her back, I used a couple of story points in the first ISIS to, create the temptation of John Haynes, and I created this story from a single story point in the first ISIS, and then I created Isis Amari's Revenge and started the ISIS series from a couple of story points in ISIS where she talks about her previous relationship with a jealous princess who hated her. I used that from a single story point in the first ISIS, and I used an East story point to talk about to create the temptation of John Haynes, and that's how good storytellers work. They take single story points and they create a brand new story around them. They don't need to go all the way into the continuity talking about all these details in history. No, they find single story points and they use that as the foundation to build their plots and their stories with. And I'm not seeing that type of creativity. I mean, that's how you do it because that's how continuity really should be used. It's more of a tool, it's a tool that you use to create brand new stories. If you create an existing old story, you take an old story, you find a plot point, you use that plot point to create a brand new story. And that's how serialized storytelling pretty much works. You just find your plot points and you use them to create your stories, and that allows you to build your foundation for your universe. But what I'm seeing is a lot of people these days are so caught up in continuity that they're trying to recreate whole stories, or they're trying to trying to revise history around stories, like what DC did with Identity Crisis, where they tried to revise history. And when you try to revise history, that really creates more of a continuity nightmare. And that's what can cause your entire story structure to collapse because you're trying to add pieces to, a unit that had already been established. And when you do that, you're really getting ready to damage, your whole history. I mean, if you pick a story point, yeah, that's nice. If you pick a story point um, here and there from an old story, or you pick an obscure point, you can really build a great original story. Um, Another thing that I did when I was creating new stories was when I wrote this book, The Thetas. Now, this is a contemporary, women's fiction story, but a lot of people don't know. I used one story point in this book right in the middle where to launch the entire ISIS series. They don't know that I used this book, one story point, to launch the entire ISIS series. And that was because I needed to create a timeline to establish the character in the 20th century. The first ISIS took place in 1883, I believe, and I needed a timeline, and I used the Thetas, one sentence in the Thetas to create the timeline. Um, and that's how build and create brand new stories. But a lot of people I'm seeing don't know how to do that, so they go in the comic world, they go around and they come around and they create these big events, not understanding that, again, the world has changed, the story model really needs to change with it. I mean, nobody's really adapting. Instead of adapting, creative people are regressing and trying to reminisce about older stuff. There's nothing wrong with refreshing something or making something new, but you have to make it relatable to people of today if they're going to get into it. I mean, and I don't see that, these days, especially with anyone who works at the big two. I don't see a lot of people focusing on creating something unique and original. I see a lot of rehashing, revamping, and they when they revamp, they go back and create something that is really based on something from 30 years ago, and that's not relatable to kids of today. I mean, a lot of people need to really start looking at what's going on today if they want to create, comics to reach new readers. You have to create content that really relates to them, their story, their experience, because that allows the characters to be relatable to this generation, just like they were to the previous generation, and it allows them a little bit more fluidity, so that they can move forward. And I don't see that. I mean, you cannot bring keep recreating 1980s stories and 1980s story models and try to move them into a 2016 world. And that's one of the big problems I see, is just everyone's still stuck in the past. And because everybody's stuck in the past, comics struggle to have a future in the 21st century. I believe that there can be a future for superhero comics in the 21st century, but it requires people to start adapting instead of regressing and reminiscing. They need to start adapting, and start looking at different story models, different story points, different paradigms, and really show what's unique. I see a big problem with everybody these days. Everybody wants to be the next Alan Moore or the next Frank Miller, but that type of story model is pretty much outdated. It's time for people to start creating, their own type of story model. Look at different things like I do when I write. I look at things like manga, different sci-fi, and I look at those different types of stories, for different types of story models, because there are other ways to tell a great comic story. There are different ways to do fantasy and superheroes, but it requires coming out of the box and trying something different. Yes, it's great to look at older stories, but you have to create stories that people today can look at and say, that's me, that's my experience, that's something I can relate to. So when they go out to the store, they'll feel like this is a story that relates to me, story that relates to my experience, and it's something I want to buy because this character reminds me of myself. And identification is one of the core, tenets of selling superheroes. People have to relate to this character if they're going to go out and buy it. And they cannot buy a character that reminds them of their father's time. They really want a character that relates to their time, their experiences, their culture, their world. And that's something that the industry really needs to start focusing on, is creating more material that relates to the kids of this generation, the kids of this world, and the kids of this time, and their experiences in the world, their politics that's going on in the world, and the life that's going on right now. That's all I have to say for this video. You can pick up great books from the SJS Direct imprint, like The Temptation of John Haynes, Isis Amari's Revenge, and the original Isis, on Amazon.com in paperback and an ebook. They're great action-packed fantasy reads that anybody of all ages can access, and it's just great storytelling. And that's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.